Welcome back to the Chelsweets kitchen. To celebrate Easter this year, I've made this really festive Easter bunny cake. It's made with my favorite vanilla layer cake recipe, and all of the frosting is my classic American buttercream. So I'm going to walk you guys through all the steps of how this cake comes together. Before we get going on the cake, I actually made the ears for the bunny rabbit. And this is important to do ahead of time because they need to firm up before you can add them to the cake so that they'll keep their shape. So I cut out both the white portion and the pink portion, which was slightly smaller. I then added some wooden skewers and kind of glued the two pieces of fondant together using a little bit of vodka. The reason you use vodka is because it dries faster because of the high alcohol content. I also made the bunny rabbit's nose and eyeballs while I was at it since I already had my fondant out. So you can see the white powder on my cutting board is some cornstarch, and I love dusting my surface with that before I work with fondant, just so that it doesn't stick. It makes things a lot easier to move and to cut. So I also made some little feet for my bunny rabbit as well, and I set those aside to dry. Next, I trimmed my cake layers using a serrated knife, and then leveled them as well. So if you guys want to learn more about how to trim cake layers or how to level them, I have a detailed tutorial, and you can click on the link in the upper right corner to watch it. So I prepared all of my cake layers like this, and you can see I made some beautiful marbled green cake layers just by adding some green gel food coloring to my vanilla layer cake recipe. So I'm frosting this with a very generous layer of my classic American buttercream, but you could have fun with this. Since it's an Easter cake, you could definitely make it coconut flavored, or you could add some toasted coconut between the layers. There's a lot of options. Once I had stacked my 3 cake layers, and these are 8-inch cake layers, I added a thin coat of frosting all the way around the cake to trap in any crumbs. I smoothed this using my bench scraper, and then I popped the cake into the freezer to chill for about 5 minutes once it was fully smoothed. This helps the crumb coat firm up and makes it so much easier to get a really smooth second coat of frosting. So for the outside of this cake, I colored some of my remaining buttercream a light shade of green, and I then added a much thicker second layer of frosting. It's important that you do add a pretty thick layer here to have an easier time getting nice smooth sides. If you guys want to watch a full tutorial on how to get really smooth sides on your cake, I also have a very long video on that which shares all of my tips and tricks, and I highly recommend watching it. The ironic part is, even though I spent all that time getting my cake really smooth, we're actually going to cover it with some piping of different shades of green frosting to kind of look like grass. So the whole idea for this cake is that we're making almost like a little garden scene, and our bunny rabbit is going to be hopping right out of the cake. So once I had a piped green frosting all up the sides of the cake, I added some chocolate ganache on the top to kind of look like the hole that the bunny rabbit is hopping out of. And then it's time for the real fun, so now we're going to start constructing our bunny rabbit. So to make him, I'm using 4-inch cake layers that I didn't level so they're a little bit domed. I'm also using a bubble tea straw to help keep everything together and in place, and to also add a little bit of stability. So it almost acts kind of like a dowel, and I know that it's a little bit unconventional because it is plastic, but they're so much easier to work with than wooden dowels, at least for me, so I really enjoy using them. So that first layer is going to be the rabbit's body, and these next 2 layers that I'm going to add on top are going to be its head. So I'm placing the flat sides next to each other to create a sphere. And I'm going to cover this in a nice layer of buttercream just to keep everything together and to add a little bit more shape. So now you can see it's starting to kind of look like a bunny rabbit, but I'm using an acetate sheet to help smooth out that frosting. And an acetate sheet is really just a thin piece of plastic that works wonderfully on sculpted cakes. As you can see, it helps get the frosting really nice and smooth, and is so much easier to use than any other smoothing tool. I also added some crushed Oreos on top of that ganache, and some score marks on the bunny rabbit's paws to make it look a little bit more fun. To fill in on the rest of the cake, I added some more little dots of frosting to look like the top bits of grass. Once the top of the cake was fully covered, I used some white buttercream to pipe some ovals onto the side of the cake to look just like the bunny rabbit's feet. So I smoothed these out using my offset spatula and my acetate sheet, and then I added in those pink fondant cutouts that we made earlier. Since this is an Easter themed cake and it is spring, I wanted to add some buttercream flowers to the side of the cake. I thought it'd be a really fun pop of color, and it would just make the cake a little bit more springy. So using a flower nail and a small cutout of parchment paper, I piped buttercream flowers using a few different frosting tips. So to make this small buttercream rose, I'm using a Wilton 103 tip, which is really just a small petal tip. And for that previous orange flower, I used a really small French tip. So you can use whatever tips you have on hand, and you can make whatever your favorite buttercream flowers are. I think these are some pretty standard ones that aren't too crazy, and they're pretty easy to make. So I popped those into the freezer for about 10 minutes until they were firm to the touch. So you can see I'm just lifting them right off of the parchment paper and placing them on the cake, just by adding a little dollop of extra green buttercream. Originally, I thought these were going to be perfectly spaced out, but I really went to town adding them onto this cake, so their placement is a bit sporadic, but that's okay. I think that's what real flowers look like in the wilderness, right? That's what I'm going to tell myself. So all that was left now was to add on the bunny rabbit's ears and facial features. So I used a bit of extra buttercream to add on his eyes and his nose, and I also added on a little mouth as well. And that's it. Our bunny rabbit cake, sculpted bunny rabbit cake, is complete. So this is a fun cake because it is a bit more challenging, but it also isn't too out of control, and it's pretty stable. So I'm going to cut a nice big slice of those marbled green cake layers, which are just beautiful, and of course it tastes delicious as well. So thanks so much for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial. If you have any questions or any other suggestions for Easter cakes, I'd love to hear them, and I hope you guys have a wonderful Easter. I'll see you guys again soon.